Alright, lesson 4.8, we're going to be talking about comparing and ordering fractions. And this is certainly an important thing to know because we always aren't dealing with fractions that have the same denominator. And when fractions don't have a common denominator, we need to find that. So the least common denominator, or LCD, but we'll pretty much use the term least common denominator more often. It is of two or more fractions. It is the least common multiple, LCM, the least common multiple of their denominators. So let's take a look at an example. Comparing 5/8 and 7/10. Well, those do not have common denominators, so we must find the least common denominator. And it's always easy to say, well, I can multiply 8 times 10 and get 80. But that's not always going to be easy when I start multiplying really large numbers. So finding the least one is always going to make it a little bit easier in the long run. So our least common multiple of 8, well, I've got 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, and 48. And I could keep on going. And this is a 4, but I could look at 10 and know, well, 10 times 1 is 10, 2 times 10 is 20, 3 times 10 is 30, 4 times 10 is 40, and that was a 4 as well. My least common denominator is 40. So that is what I'm going to work with. So I want to make my denominator 40, but how did I get there? Well, 8 times 5 is 40, and so whatever I do to my denominator, I have to do to my numerator. And the same rule applies. If I had to change my numerator, I do the same thing to my denominator. So 8 times 5 is 40, so 5 times 5 is 25. Now, I multiplied 10 by 4 to get to 40. So I have to multiply 7 by 4, and I get 28. So when I compare this, I say, well, 25/40 is what compared to 28/40? Well, since I have common denominators, I can just look at my numerators and say, well, 25 is less than 28. So 5/8 must be less than 7/10. Let's take another look at a different example. If you're needing a piece of lumber that is 4 3/16 feet long, is a 4 1/4, 4 1/4 foot piece long enough? Since the whole numbers are the same, we can compare. Obviously, if they were not the same, we would take whatever fraction has a larger whole number. So since they have common the same whole numbers, we look at the fraction part. And when we look at 16 and 4, well, 16 is a multiple of 4. So 16 is our least common denominator. So I don't have to change anything for my 3/16 because 16 times 1 is 16. So 3 times 1 is 3. So for 1/4, to get 16 as my denominator, I need to multiply by 4. So 4 times 4 is 16. And I have to do the same to my numerator. 1 times 4 is 4. So 3/16 and 4/16, common denominators, I can just look at my numerators and say 3 is less than 4. So 4 3/16 must be less than 4 4/16. So that must mean that the 4 1/4 foot piece is long enough. So now it's a quick check. I'll let you go through and try these. In example 2, or for number 2, it asks for you to reference example 2. I've copied it right here, but you look up on top of your, above this example 2 before to answer. So go ahead and try these, and I'll check in with you in a little bit. Alright, if you're not done, go ahead and pause, but I'm going to go through and check this. So comparing 6/8 and 7/9. So to compare, I need to have a common denominator. And common denominator between 8 and 9, well, 8 times 9 would give us 72. So we're going to multiply each fraction by that number to get to 72 for our denominator. So 8 times 9, so 6/8, and I'm going to multiply 8 times 9, and I get 72. So I have to do the same thing to my numerator. 6 times 9 is 54. And then for my 7/9, I have to multiply 9 times 8, and I get 72. So I do the same thing multiplying 7 times 8, and I get 56. So looking at my two fractions, 54 over 72 and 56 over 72, looking at just the numerator now since I have common denominators, 54 is less than 56. So 6/8 is less than 7/9. So for example 2, or for quick check number 2, we look at example 2, and it says, would a 4 and 5 30 seconds foot piece of lumber be long enough? Well, we have to apply the same process, and we don't need this part of our question because that's the old one. The piece of wood that we're comparing it with is 4 and 3/16. And I want to know, is 4 and 5 over 32 greater than or less than or equal to it? So I need to make my fractions be the same, or same common denominator. So 16 times 1 is 16. 16 times 2 is 32. So I can now take my denominator times 2, and I can get 32. And I do that same to my numerator, and 3 times 2 is 6. So when I compare 6 over 32 to 5 over 32, 6 is greater than 5. So if I wanted to compare it with my 4 and 5 foot piece of lumber, no, that is not going to be long enough. It's just 1 32nd less than what we are needing. So no, it will not be long enough. So let's go back to our examples. So for example 3, now we are needing to order these fractions. And in order to order, we have to compare using common denominators. So ordering our fractions, 1 and, we'll highlight this so that we keep track of them. We have 1 and 3 3/4, 7/10, 1 and 11/12, and 5/8. So looking at them, I can already tell that my numbers that have whole numbers, my fractions that have whole numbers, they're already going to be greater than my 7/10 and 5/8. So we're not going to look at those yet. We can compare those later. So right now, let's just compare our 7/10 and our 5/8. So looking at 7/10 and 5/8, 10 and 8 being our denominators, we need to find a common denominator, least common denominator between those two, and that's going to be 40, because remember 8 times 1 is 8, 8 times 2 is 16, 8 times 3 is 24, 8 times 4 is 32, 8 times 5 is 40. 10 again, 10 times 10 is 10, times 2 is 20, times 3 is 30, times 4 is 40. That is our least common denominator. So I multiplied 10 times 4 to get to 40, so I do the same thing to my 7 times 4, and I get 28. Oh, and our least common denominator is 40 for that box up there. Now for our 8, I multiplied that times 5 to get to 40. So I multiply 5 times 8, or 5 times 5, and I get 25. So when I compare these two, I have 25/40 is less than 28/40. And my 25/40 was my 5/8. So 5/8 is less than my 7/10. So now we have two of those fractions in order, but let's now compare our fractions that have mixed numbers. So ordering the mixed number ones, we do the same thing since they have same whole numbers. So 3/4 and 11/12. Well, I know that 4 can be multiplied by 3 to get to 12, so I can just leave 12 as is. So 4 times 3 is 12, and I do the same thing to my numerator. 3 times 3 is 9. So 9/12 is less than 11/12. So to order our mixed numbers, the 3/4, which I converted to 9/12, that's going to be my 1 and 3/4, which is less than 1 and 11/12. So now I need to put them in order completely. So looking at the previous step, I had 5/8 as my least. So 5/8 is the least one, followed by 7/10, followed by 1 and 3/4, and then the greatest one of that set was 1 and 11/12. Alright, now we're to another quick check, and you're to order 2 and 5/6, 3/8, 1/3, 2 and 4/5, and 1 and 2/3 from least to greatest. So go ahead, pause, and work through that, and I'll check in with you in a little bit. Alright, so let's check to see our order. So when I look at this, I already can tell that 2 as my whole number, 2 and 5/6, that's greater than any of the individual fractions, 2 and 4/5. That's going to be those two I'm going to have to compare against each other, because 1 and 2/3, that's already going to be less than our fractions with the 2 as a whole. So I'm going to first start off by comparing my two numbers here, 3/8 and 1/3. So 3/8 and 1/3, common denominator between 3 and 8 is 24. So I multiplied, that's a 4, I multiplied 8 times 3 to get to 24, so I'm going to multiply 3 times 3, and I'm going to get 9. So for my 1/3, I multiplied by 3 times 8 to get 24, so I multiply 1 times 8, and I get 8. So 1/3 is less than 3/8, so that's going to be my first set of fractions that I can compare, or I can put into order. So 1/3 is less than 3/8. So now I can look at my whole or my mixed numbers. Well, I already know that 1 and 2/3 is less than the other two mixed numbers because it has a 1 in the whole number spot. So I already can put that one in as 1 and 2/3. 2/3. Alright, and now I can compare my 2 and 5/6 and 2 and 4/5. Well, since I have same whole numbers, I don't need to compare that part, but I need to compare 5/6 and 4/5. Common denominator between 6 and 5, well, we'll use 30. And I multiplied 6 times 5 to get to 30, so I'm going to multiply 5 times 5 and get 25. And then I multiplied my 5 times 6 to get to 30, so I'm going to multiply 4 times 6 and get 24. And I can see that 24 is less than 25, so that must mean that my order is 2 and 4/5 is less than 2 and 5/6. So my complete order from least to greatest would be 1/3 is less than 3/8, which is less than 1 and 2/3, which is less than 2 and 4/5, which is less than 2 and 5/6. That brings us to the end of 4.8, comparing and ordering fractions.